Rolex, the fascinating story. Rolex is one of the most exclusive brands in the world, with an estimated $8 billion in market value. The company's history goes back a century and began with a young orphan whose fortune was stolen. He fled his hometown and relocated to another nation with nothing but his resolve to conquer his difficulties. He spent some time working his way up before deciding to follow his passion and start a watchmaking company. He had no idea that this entrepreneurial endeavor would help him pioneer contemporary wristwatches, revolutionize the watch industry, and build a multi-billion-dollar empire. Welcome to Best Wonders, where today we'll be telling you the fascinating story of how Rolex came to be. But before we continue, be sure to like, subscribe, and click that notification bell so you get more videos like this. Now, let's move on to the video. On March 22, 1881, Hans Wilsdorf was born in Kumbach, Germany, to Anna and Johann Daniel Wilsdorf. He was the second of 3 children, and his family has a middle-class business selling iron goods that had been passed down from his grandfather. Unfortunately, his mother passed away in 1892 after falling ill in the following years, and a year later, his father also died, leaving him an orphan at the age of 12. Now in the care of his mother's brothers, Hans's uncle made a quick decision to sell the family business and use some of the proceeds for their education. He enrolled all 3 of them in the posh boarding school Ernestin Coburg in Bavaria, Germany. From the start, Hans detested this choice and struggled to adjust to life there. Hans loved reading and developed into quite an intelligent student in school. He excelled particularly in mathematics and languages, where he learned both French and English. Hans was always interested in travel and knew that languages would be very useful, which would eventually play a big role in his career. During his school years, he made friends with a Swiss boy who would tell him tales of his birthplace in La Chaux-de-Fonds, a city in Switzerland that was well known for its long history in the watchmaking industry. When Hans reached the age of 19, he decided he had had enough of his way of life and moved from the German boarding school to Geneva, Switzerland. There, he found work as an apprentice for an international pearl exporting company that purchased pearls from various markets and graded and packaged them for sale to jewelers. Hans noticed that the company wasn't really producing anything but was still making a lot of money there, so he immersed himself to learn their business strategies. Hans received a letter from a friend one day offering him a position with a business called Kuno Corten. At the time, Kuno Corten was one of the largest high-quality watchmaking companies and exported pocket watches worth around 1 million Swiss francs annually. The British Empire and America, the 2 richest countries in the world at the time, sent him letters, so they recruited him since he could read and write English and respond to them. Hans developed a fascination with watch movements and their precision when he was in Kuno Corten. His lifelong passion had its beginnings at this point. Young Hans Wilsdorf founded a watch company in London, England in 1905 with the help of his brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, who was married to Anna Wilsdorf. This business, Wilsdorf and Davis, specialized in selling wristwatches throughout the British Empire, not just in Great Britain. Wilsdorf and Davis obtained watch components from a number of Swiss suppliers, including precision movements from the Swiss company Egler in Bienne. The name Rolex was subsequently trademarked by Wilsdorf and Davis in Switzerland 3 years later on July 2, 1908. Even though Hans loved watches, there was one significant aspect of the watch industry that he found unfavorable. At the time, wristwatches were primarily worn by women as jewelry and were despised by some because they were less accurate at telling the time than pocket watches. These watches were also smaller than pocket watches and contained smaller movements, which would frequently cause the clock to go faster or slower due to minute details in the movements. Due to their hefty size, pocket watches were more fashionable at the time and were seen to be masculine, but Hans generally found them to be cumbersome to operate. He found it annoying every time he had to reach his hand into his pocket to check the time, especially when his hands were busy. Hans predicted that wristwatches would eventually become the new standard for everyone and was fully committed to finding a way to make the ideal wristwatch for it. He spent the following years traveling to numerous nations throughout Europe and meeting countless watchmakers to discuss the intricate details of watches. At the same time that he founded his company, he began to release his own wristwatches. One watch after another, he was crafting the perfect wristwatch. Hans spent a lot of time combining 5 letters from the alphabet to come up with something until finally Rolex was born. Soon after, his company started to gain some traction, and by 1908, it was one of the top firms in the watchmaking industry in England. Hans wanted to change the name of his company to something high-class, catchy, and easy to say regardless of the language. As soon as he saw it, he knew that it was the ideal one, and a few days later, in 1908, he registered the name Rolex as a trademark for Wilsdorf and Davis Limited. Over the next few years, Rolex became well known for its high-quality wristwatches, and many wealthy people began wearing them. However, it wasn't long before the First World War broke out, and many businesses, including watch firms, struggled to remain in business, but not for Rolex. Because of the already reliable wristwatches made by Hans's company, many soldiers were given Rolex watches instead of pocket watches because they were easier to use and safer to wear. Rolex watches also helped soldiers better coordinate their attacks because of their accuracy on time. By this time, the company had grown to the point where they were employing 60 people in 1914 and had large open office spaces in London to further their credibility. Not everything was peaches and rainbows for Hans. In 1914, the British implemented a 33% tax on all businesses registered in Great Britain that were exporting goods across international borders. This became a major concern for Hans, so he moved the headquarters of his company from London to Bienne, Switzerland, to avoid these taxes. Hans also made his move because after the First World War, British citizens started to dislike Germans because the name Hans Wilsdorf was obviously German. Additionally, as a result of this, he changed the name of his business entirely from Wilsdorf and Davis Limited to Rolex Watch Corporation Limited in 1915. People went crazy for the watch, and Hans capitalized on the buzz by placing an advertisement in front of the London Daily Mail newspaper. At this point, Rolex became known worldwide as a revolutionary timepiece. Since people were already hooked on the products, Hans decided to heavily promote Rolex. In 1928, he collaborated with the top British model at the time, Evelyn Lane, to promote his watches. Of course, there were pictures of her sporting her wristwatch. And Hans also advertised his Rolex Oyster inside fish bowls with real fish in them on the sale display of every Rolex dealership for people to see when they walked by. This brilliant strategy worked amazingly, and people became hooked on the products by now. The exposure didn't end there, however, because in 1933, Rolex Oysters were mentioned once more in the papers in connection with a flight over Mount Everest. The crew members wearing Rolex watches were delighted to see that after the flight, their watches were still fully operational. Even with all of his accomplishments, Hans would occasionally struggle to break into the market and had to work twice as hard to build a successful company because of his German name. When World War II started, Rolex took a hard hit and it became expensive and difficult to export products outside of Switzerland to some other major markets in Europe. Hans was frustrated by the situation, and to compound his bad luck, another tragedy followed when his wife passed away in 1944. As soon as World War II ended, Rolex took off. To give you an idea, in 1946, Rolex had sold its 50,000th certified Rolex chronometer, which they started certifying 20 years earlier by the next year. Shortly before Hans's death, Hans transferred 100% ownership of Rolex to the Wills Dorr Foundation, which still owns and controls Rolex to this day. Rolex will never go public, be sold, nor will they ever pay any taxes because it's essentially a charity. Rolex continued to release a number of innovative watches during the 1950s. The most renowned was the Rolex Submariner, introduced in 1953. It was the first deep-diving waterproof wristwatch that could reach 10 meters. Nearly 10 years later, the Rolex Day-Date was the first waterproof and self-winding wristwatch to not only include the date of the month, but also the day of the week. After his passing, Rolex began to position itself as the luxury brand it is today. The company concentrated its marketing efforts on positioning itself as an exclusive watch collection for members of high society, which was successful. Another point to consider is that in 1985, Rolex became the first watch company to manufacture its watches with 904L, a very durable and expensive steel, which is one of the reasons for their high prices today. Rolex remains the most recognizable luxury brand. Did you know of this luxury company's history? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell for more of the world's best wonders.